the section 1.4 test process. In this section, we'll start with the test process in context. So, basically, one needs to be aware of the testing context, like what life cycle model is being followed, what project methodology is being followed. Basically, what I mean by that is are we following waterfall model, are we following V model, or are we following agile? So one needs to be very much aware about the life cycle and project methodologies that are being followed, and test levels. One need to be aware of what we mean by test level is is it unit testing, component testing, is it integration testing, system testing, user acceptance testing, testing levels one should be aware of, and the testing types. In testing types we have functional, non-functional, right, and then structural and regression hours. So one needs to be aware about the life cycle model being followed, the project methodologies being followed. Excuse me. And one needs to be aware about the testing levels, what all levels the testing activity operates at, and test types. So what are the testing types? Basically, functional, non-functional, structural, and regression hours. And what are the product and project risks? So what are the risks are in product risks and project risks are involved, and one also needs to be aware of what is the business domain for which you are carrying out testing. So, say for example, as we were talking about, there are wide varieties of software like utility software, embedded software, mission critical software, scientific software, system software. So one needs to be aware of the business domain for which you are doing testing. And then there are operational constraints, we don't have infinite budgets and resources. How much time is allocated for testing, what are the complexities involved, and last but not least, contractual and regulatory environment in which one is operating. So, so these all things constitute test process context. So one needs to be aware about the context while doing testing activities. Next comes the test activities. So test activities, as we were talking about, test activities involve planning, monitoring and control, analysis, design, implementation, execution, and completion, right? So you start with planning how to carry out the testing, and then you do test analysis, how to come up with test cases, and then you design the test cases and actually implement the test cases, you execute the test cases, and finally you do completion. And monitoring and control spans across all these activities. So when test planning, what do we do? In test planning, what we do is we take the test results and logs. Basically we come up with objectives and approaches to meet the we first come up with objectives, and then we come up with approach to meet those objectives. And test monitoring and control basically involves checking test results, whether the test cases are passed or failed, and going through the logs, and whether specified coverage is met or not. So that activities we will be doing in monitoring and control, and then assessing component or system quality based on results of logs. So once you run the test cases, like monitoring and control I'm talking about, you come to know, whether the component or system is of required quality or not by going through the logs. And then you decide if more test cases need to be added. And in analysis phase, what we do is, we go through the requirement specification, and then design and implementation information, and then we also assess the risks. So basically, if you are going through a test basis, what I mean by test basis is the documents that you use as a basis for coming up with the test cases. You also need to check, during analysis phase, if there are any ambiguities, are there any omissions, ambiguities meaning uh, two meanings or three meanings from a same sentence. Like there should not be any ambiguities. You eliminate any ambiguities in ambiguities. You eliminate all the ambiguities in test cases, and you check also for omissions if anything is missed out in test basis. And are there any inconsistencies? Like inconsistencies is one sentence saying something and other saying contradicting that. So such inconsistencies you look for, and inaccuracies, and you also check for inaccuracies. And all these things should not be there when you are going through the test basis. Then comes test design. So you design and prioritize the test cases, identify the necessary test data, what test data needs to be supplied for test cases, and you also design the test environment in which the test cases should be run, and you also check and capture bidirectional traceability. What I mean by that is, for every requirement, is there a test case or not, and how the requirement maps to the test case, and how the requirement maps to the test case, and how test case maps to the requirement, bidirectional traceability. And in test implementation, you actually develop the test case. If it is manual test cases, you document what all manual steps are involved, and if it is automated test cases, you actually come up with test scripts. And then in implementation phase, you also, what you do is you create test suites and automated test scripts. As we were talking about earlier, test suites is related test cases collection. So you come up with automated test scripts. So you come up with scripts which you can use for actually running the test cases. Uh, Arrange the test suites within test execution schedule. So you also ensure that the testing is done within the predefined schedule, and building the test environment. So for example, let's say a test environment is environment where you actually set up an environment for executing the test cases. So this test environment should be as close to the real environment where the product is supposed to function. And you also prepare test data during test implementation, what all kinds of test data you are supposed to supply, and verifying and updating bidirectional traceability. So, you ensure that there is a traceability from test requirements to test cases and vice versa. And next comes test execution. During test execution, you either execute a manual test cases or automated test cases, and you compare actual versus expected results. So let's say, as we were talking about a scientific software like Sage, integration of certain function, like in calculus, integration of certain function is giving the intended result or not, you check, right? And so the actual result should be as per the expected result, and you also analyze anomalies. Like if there are any anomalies, like meaning any deviation from the expected behavior, you check it, and then you identify the anomalies, and you report the defects. Like if there are any defects, if let's say integration function is not giving the expected result, you log it as a defect, and you also log the outcome, whether the test cases have passed or failed. Now, test completion. This is a most important last phase. Uh, Before we conclude the testing activity, we check whether all the reported defects by the testers are closed or not, and then you come up with the test case summary. Like basically, you say how many test cases are executed, how many are passed, how many have failed, and then if you decide to go ahead with the failure, you also need to document what percentage of the test cases are failure, and then you finalizing and archiving the test cases. So you archive meaning you keep it for future references. Like for example, we executed 1,000 test cases. Out of these test cases, so many have passed, so many have failed, and then you archive the test ways. Okay, so like test wares is the entities that you would have used for testing, like right from test requirement, to test execution and reporting and closure. So all the test wares, entities that you would have generated, you archive, and you hand over the test wares to customer. Depends on the situation. So if the customer is interested in the test wares, you hand over the test wares. Least is logs. At least you should hand over to indicate that you conducted the testing, and that is a proof of testing conducted. And analyzing uh, lessons learned. This is most important. Whether it is agile, we have retrospectives, whether it's agile, V, or waterfall. You summarize the best practices that you would have come up with, and what lessons you learned, positive or negative. You analyze them, and you try to repeat what was positive and try to eliminate what was negative. Next is test work products, as we were talking about. All these phases, right? Planning, analysis, design, implementation, execution, and completion would have created products. So those are called the test was work product, and then you ensure traceability between test bases and test work products. So it's a bi-directional traceability. You ensure that for every requirement there is a test case and test case execution logs, test case execution reports, and things like that. This is from test basis, from requirement to test cases, and in other direction also, similar things are applicable. Meaning from test case to test logs, and from test logs to test cases, something like that. And then next section will cover in next chapter. Next section will cover later. Thank you.